So we're going to start off, as we always do in improvement work, in getting a shared understanding of what our baseline position is. So what's the state of things now? And I'm absolutely delighted that we have Professor Nicola Heslehurst that's going to take us through the kind of data and insights around this important topic. Now, Nicola is Professor of Maternal and Child Nutrition at Newcastle University. And I don't know if any of you ever, watched, I think it was called Football Focus in the past, but there was someone there called Stato who knew all the stats. Well, Nicola's our Stato for the day. So she is going to be taking us through this now. So can we give a warm welcome for Nicola?
I wondered where that was going with the Football Focus. I thought you'd got the wrong speaker for a minute. So thanks so much for inviting me along to speak today. The programme looks fantastic, and as someone who does organise national and international conferences, I really appreciate the amount of work that goes in behind the scenes. It's great to hear the buzz in the room, and the programme looks great. I'm really looking forward to the workshops. I'm a Professor of Maternal and Child Nutrition at Newcastle University. I have another hat though. I'm also President of the UK Association for the Study of Obesity. Some of you might be familiar with the ASO, others not. It's a scientific charity which aims to advance the knowledge around obesity to make a difference from both prevention and treatment perspectives. Please come and chat with me if you want to find out more about the ASO. The talk today, while obesity and the topics that are going to be covered are quite broad, I'm going to focus in a little bit around the pregnancy and early life course stage, and really focus on why it's important to address obesity from this early life course stage. I'm going to start off talking a little bit around the stats, around maternal weight, pregnancy outcomes and life course health, talk a little bit around health inequalities, and then end really with a focus on weight stigma and why that's important to look at. So I'm sure everybody in the room knows obesity prevalence has been increasing, and it's no different in pregnancy. So maternal obesity is usually measured by BMI at the first appointment in pregnancy. And a BMI of over 30 at that point is a kind of a proxy measure for preconception obesity. Around 22% of all pregnancies in England start off with a BMI over 30, and these data that were published in the Woman of the North report early this year show that the North East region has the highest prevalence of maternal obesity, with around 27 to 28%. And within maternity services within the North East, there's also huge variation, with some above 30%. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail around the health outcomes, other than to say this is a really nice schematic that summarises some of the evidence on health outcomes for both the mum and the baby in the short and long term. But I think we're all here, we all understand that obesity has an impact on health. But just as an example, maternal obesity is associated with an increased risk of complications during pregnancy and delivery, such as gestational diabetes and hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. There are risks to the baby, including stillbirth, congenital anomalies. In saying that, they're still very rare outcomes, so we've got to be careful about how we portray risk so that we don't cause harm by increasing anxiety. But higher birth weight babies as well. The longer-term outcomes for both the mum and baby are what you might expect to see: an increased risk of further development of overweight and obesity, type 2 diabetes, and all of the non-communicable diseases that we see with obesity in the general population. And this loop shows the intergenerational impact. So women may go on to have subsequent pregnancies and start their pregnancy with a higher BMI, with even further increased risks. And the children of those pregnancies will also potentially go on to have pregnancies themselves, and this intergenerational cycle. So I'm just going to very briefly dive into a couple of the longer term outcomes, particularly for the child, and how pregnancy is an important time period for childhood obesity. So these are some data that we published a few years ago now from a meta-analysis, where a meta-analysis, for anyone who doesn't know, is where we take all of the evidence that's been published to date, we pool it together and do a kind of really big analysis of international data. And what these data show in brief is that as maternal BMI increases at the start of pregnancy, so does the risk of the child going on to develop obesity. If the mother starts off the pregnancy with a BMI in the overweight range, then the child from that pregnancy has an 89% increased risk of developing obesity throughout their childhood. Whereas if the mother starts off the pregnancy with a BMI in the obesity range, that risk increases to 264% increased risk of that child going on to develop obesity throughout childhood. So a really important time for both the mum's health, but also for the child's health. Similarly, this is not data from my work, but from a team in Aberdeen who looked at very long-term data linkage for children into their 40s, so into adulthood, and looked at associations between maternal BMI category and the child's risk of developing type 2 diabetes through to adulthood, or actually any diabetes. And what they found was if the mother had a BMI in the obesity range, then they had an increased risk of developing any type of diabetes. When they stratified this by the type of diabetes, we can see this is really driven by an increased risk of the child going on to develop type 2 diabetes rather than type 1 diabetes, is what you might expect to see. But again, if we look at the actual numbers, the hazard ratio of 3.48 for maternal obesity shows that the children born from pregnancies with the mother had obesity during pregnancy were over 3 times as likely to develop type 2 diabetes throughout their life course. And I'm sure everybody knows how important breastfeeding is, both for women's health, but also for child health. And we obviously have recommendations from WHO to exclusively breastfeed up until 6 months of age. This data shows quite nicely how important continuing breastfeeding beyond that time stage is, alongside complementary feeding. So the downward slope on this graph shows that the longer a baby is breastfed for, the less chance they have of going on to develop obesity later in life. The data only goes up to 15 months of age, but by 15 months of age, the risk of developing child obesity is almost halved. Okay, so I'm going to move on to health inequalities. Again, sticking with pregnancy throughout this talk. There are a lot of numbers here. I'm not going to read all the numbers or expect you to read all of these numbers. But in short, we looked at UK-wide data, so this is from all 4 nations of the UK, and looked at the prevalence of maternal obesity according to deprivation measured by index of multiple deprivation. Any numbers in this table that are bold, which is all of them, show an increased risk with increasing level of deprivation and having a BMI in the overweight or obesity class 1, 2 or 3 categories. And what these data show us is that, I don't think I can point, can I? No. Okay, what these data show us is as the level of deprivation increases from least deprived to most deprived, so does the odds of a woman having a BMI in any of these categories above the recommended BMI range. But this is most pronounced for women with class 3 obesity, so a BMI of over 40, who are more than 3 times as likely to be living in areas of highest deprivation. These data are for pregnancy. We could replicate this data with pretty much any population, and it really just shows how important the environment is in determining obesity. Now, ethnicity data is a lot more complex, and I wanted to show this example of what not to do when you're analysing data. So we again looked at UK-wide data, including all nations of the UK, which included Northern Ireland, who only had data for minoritized ethnic groups combined. And when we looked at minoritized ethnic groups compared with white women, we found an increased risk of having overweight or class 1 obesity, those bold numbers, but a reduced risk for class 2 or class 3 obesity. When we dropped the Northern Ireland data and we were able to look in a little bit more detail at different ethnic groups within that combined population, we found that that really masked what was happening for black women. So black women were between 2 and 2.5 times as likely to have obesity in any of the obesity classes. If we had data at even kind of lower level of these categories, we would obviously see patterns within black, within South Asian, and other categories as well. This is really, really important because we use data to plan policy and care and target interventions. And black women are almost 5 times more likely to die during pregnancy, and are overrepresented in terms of obesity. So by grouping minoritized ethnic groups together, we're potentially saying it's not an issue and we don't need to focus on care for this particular population, which would be an inaccurate conclusion to make. And in terms of inequalities, I just wanted to finish off talking about food insecurity. I know there's some workshops today which are going to look at food insecurity and food poverty in more detail, but just wanted to flag that this is a really increasing area of concern for everybody, but also for pregnancy, and a really unresearched area in the UK. So again, this is some meta-analysis from a systematic review that we published this year, where we pooled together international data that looked at associations between food insecurity and maternal obesity. And what we found was women who were experiencing food insecurity in pregnancy were 53% more likely to have maternal obesity than women who were food secure. These data all came from North America, from the USA and Canada. We don't actually know in the UK what the prevalence of food insecurity in pregnancy is or how this is associated with obesity. We are doing some work in this field, so watch this space, but it's a really important factor to consider when we're thinking about interventions. Okay, the final section of this talk is around stigma. Some of you might be familiar with the term obesity stigma, some might not. So obesity stigma is where people are stigmatized based on their body size, which can result in discrimination, prejudice, and lots of other factors. And obesity has been described as the last socially acceptable form of prejudice. This description was made prior to the US election, where I think we've seen that it is actually socially acceptable to a lot of people to run an election campaign and become president based on prejudice. However, from an obesity perspective, obesity and body size is not a protected characteristic. So it gives free rein for anybody to discriminate people based on body size. And weight discrimination is relevant to everybody, but it's particularly relevant during pregnancy. Women are 3 times more likely than men to experience weight discrimination, and people under the age of 45 are also the most likely group to experience weight discrimination. So this is essentially the age range and demographic for pregnancy. I'm not expecting everybody to be able to read everything in this schematic. I know certainly I wouldn't be able to without my glasses even sat at the front, but just wanted to show that obesity stigma is complex, and the contributors and consequences of obesity stigma are also complex. If anybody wants to look at this in more detail, it's the Westbury et al. 2023 citation. But we see obesity stigma in public health policy, for example. We see it from a political perspective. Even with my glasses, without my glasses, I can't read from here. We see it in the entertainment industry. Once you start noticing it, you'll see it everywhere. And we see it in media as well, including news media, journalism. And the consequences of obesity stigma are also multiple. So there are health consequences, there's psychological consequences, and there are social consequences, including discrimination in workplaces and education environments, and actually making obesity worse through lots of different mechanisms. And at the heart of obesity stigma is this oversimplification and lack of understanding about obesity causal pathways. And a real focus, something that just keeps coming back, is this focus on individuals' lifestyle choices. So the final kind of bit of data I wanted to share with you before moving on to what we can do about stigma is a study that we published a couple of years ago looking at UK newspaper media framing of maternal obesity. So we identified and analysed over 400 newspaper articles from the UK news media which had some content on maternal obesity. The schematic shows there was quite complex data and quite complex themes that came out of this analysis. But in summary, the headlines were that women living with obesity were blamed for their weight. They were blamed for risks resulting from their weight in pregnancy, particularly if the risk was to the baby. And they were also blamed for the NHS impact, the struggling maternity services. This was the fault of women. Women were solely responsible for solving obesity, not only their own obesity, but the entire society of obesity. They were producing children who were going to go on to develop obesity, and that was their responsibility to do something about that. This was really gendered from a school age. It was schoolgirls' responsibility. And women living with obesity in pregnancy were also a burden on individuals. They were a burden on themselves, their family, their children. They were a burden on society, and they were a burden to the NHS. And again, right at the heart of this, underpinning all of it, was this simplification of obesity and this focus on lifestyles and energy balance. Some of these quotes might be quite triggering. If you read this paper, there are many more like this. This is a small selection. This was the hardest research project I've ever worked on, having to read 442 newspaper articles, pretty much with this message throughout. So the bits in bold are the bits that I just wanted to really flag. So pregnant women in Scotland are the third porkiest in the world, with more than half putting their unborn tots at risk. So it was the mothers putting their babies at risk. Obesity, and this capitalisation is how it was, we haven't capitalised this, this is how it was presented. Obesity in women is as dangerous as a terror threat. The fact that figures have doubled is disgraceful, and real effort must now be put into advising obese women not to conceive in the first place. So the control of women based on their body weight. The next one really gets me. The government must rapidly ensure that every secondary school girl understands her obligation to stay in shape and look after her health, so that should she fall pregnant, completely by herself, she enters pregnancy fit. That was a quote from an expert representing an obesity organisation. And a lot of this is caused by people needing to simply overhaul their lifestyle. So we go back to that simplification of obesity and the simplification of what is needed to address obesity. So this was just one example of one study looking at stigmatising messages in the media. We did this in pregnancy. Again, if we replicated this in any population, we would see the same messages. These are probably not a surprise to anybody in this room. But stigmatising messages in the media cause harm. They cause harm to people living with obesity. They fuel an inaccurate public understanding of obesity causation. And that influences public support for policy, or rather public lack of support for policy action. And it ultimately influences policymakers' decisions. And that's where we see that kind of constant loop back to individual responsibility policy action. And for everybody in this room, I just want to say this is all of our responsibility to address stigma. We need to think about whatever hat we're wearing today in this room, that we actually reflect and take note and think, how can we change what we're doing to try and think about a more positive framing around obesity in our research, in our practice, and particularly in any media interactions. So how might you do that? Well, there's quite a lot of work that's been done to make it really easy. It is a bit of a shift. It'll take time and people will make mistakes, and that's okay. But For example, there are multiple obesity image banks that can be used to have really positive imagery around obesity. So what you tend to see is somebody's head chopped here with a burger hanging out their mouth and tight-fitting clothes that are covered in food, which really just reinforces the stigma around obesity, the message of lazy, greedy, dirty, all of those stereotypes that go along with obesity. And there are image banks that have been created that are free to use. The European Association for the Study of Obesity have nicely compiled all of these. And the couple of examples I've used here for World Obesity Federation or the European Coalition for People Living with Obesity. And they have different categories of images that could be used, whether you want children, adults, family situations, medical context. Please do look at these images. Similarly, a lot of the work's been done for us already in relation to obesity-related language that we use and how we might be proliferating obesity stigma and weight bias with some of the language that we use, and recommendations for how to switch your language. So again, World Obesity, European Association for the Study of Obesity, and Obesity Action have got some great resources around this, so please do familiarise yourself with these resources. Okay, so the key messages from today are maternal obesity prevalence is increasing everywhere, but it's highest in the northeast. It makes it a real issue for this region, for people sitting in this room. It is linked with poorer health outcomes in pregnancy, but also in longer life for mum and baby. Inequalities are really important drivers of obesity in pregnancy and early life, and we need to remember that when we're thinking about action. The level of food insecurity and obesity, how much is telling people they need to eat less and move more going to help people in that situation. Obesity framing has got consequences, and it's all of our responsibility to try and help shift that public narrative and the discourse around obesity away from stigma. And forward-looking, thinking about interventions and policy actions, these really need to be focused beyond eat less and move more narratives and the individual lifestyle choices. And this is really important to reduce stigma and harmful consequences of stigma that we see, but also to really make any difference with inequalities, we need to move beyond that individual responsibility, as Craig mentioned in his video, from a prevention perspective. And also moving away from obesity stigma will help to ensure unbiased access to evidence-based obesity care for people who need it from a treatment perspective. And I just want to end by saying, the negative press that we've been seeing, stigmatising press around the new pharmacotherapy treatments, evidence-based treatments for people living with obesity, has been really stigmatising, people just need to take control of their lifestyles, increase their willpower. And it just reminds me of 20 years ago, the same framing around bariatric surgery. We've moved a long way since then in the field of bariatric surgery. But I think, the fact a new evidence-based obesity treatment comes along and the same rhetoric is pulled out the bag shows we've made absolutely no progress whatsoever in relation to obesity stigma. So sorry to end on that, really. But, in this room today, we have real potential to do something about that, and particularly in this region where it is such an issue, to try and focus beyond individual responsibility. So thank you very much.
So, thank you, Nicola. I mean, I don't know about you, but I found that incredibly sobering. Thanks for the trigger warning that was almost a little too late, but I think it's really important to put that in the room. And I know certainly I started by feeling a little bit choked up, when you were saying that, to think that, even our young children, our girls in schools are having these messages delivered that they're being exposed to this, and then through the life cycle and through pregnancy. I felt choked up, and then I felt angry. And, I hope that if you feel like I did, that's further kind of inspired you to make something happen out of today. And I'm really, really grateful, Nicola. I mean, it seems, you know, when you whiz through a few slides of data, it by no means ever covers the enormous amount of work and the passion that drives people to conduct this research and bring all this data together that helps us to understand the situation. And our situation is poor in our population in this area. So can we just have one more round of applause for Nicola and her teams that have supported her with this? And keep that in mind throughout today.